My name is Andrew Glover, and I'll be moderating the plenary discussion today that we're calling Immobilities in 2020, Coronavirus and Beyond. I contacted David a little while ago about organising this event because I just felt it was important to capture some of the thoughts about how the world of mobilities has changed so quickly over the last few months before things sort of become normalised or become a new normal. Yeah, we've seen almost all conferences have also been cancelled this year, certainly for the first half of the year, and we're not going to have those opportunities for knowledge sharing. So hopefully events like this can go some way to serving that purpose. I've seen that some academics are actually saying that they've attended more seminars and presentations over the past few months than they'd ever done in the past, and I think that's quite encouraging. Putting aside the issues with Zoom fatigue or the Zoom apocalypse, as someone called it, I think it's important for people in remote areas and regional areas that in some sense for them, we're all kind of equally remote from each other. A lot of us are working from home still. And so the advantages of physical proximity by being at, say, a big institution in Sydney or Melbourne aren't as apparent for events like this. Like I said, everyone can attend. Even if you're overseas, it looks like we've got a few people from overseas as well, which is great. So I've been researching academic air travel for the past few years and looking at ways in which the academic and research sectors could be made less reliant on highly carbon intensive forms of mobility. And most of us fly to perform various aspects of our work, whether that's flying to conferences to do field work or take a new job in a new city or a new country. Some people even commute by flying to their work. And my collaborators and I often asked ourselves what it would take for this kind of mobility to slow down and become more sustainable. If we finally took climate change seriously, would we slow down? Would the price, if the price of oil skyrocketed, would that make flying unaffordable? If there was a volcanic eruption that caused a big global ash cloud like there was in 2010, which grounded flights in Europe for a few weeks, perhaps that would change things. And I guess we now have the answer to that question, and it's a global pandemic that really does has grounded most of us. So the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has seen rapid and essentially largely unprecedented changes to our mobility systems at all scales. As I said, global air travel has contracted dramatically, supply chains have been interrupted, and transport commuting has been replaced by working from home a lot of the time. Many of the forms of mobility that were viewed as more sustainable, like public transport on buses and trains, are now sort of viewed as more potentially risky to people's health. So has COVID-19 changed the way we think about mobility and immobility? Has the crisis shed new light on various forms of inequality and justice? What forms of mobility are we likely to see persist after the lockdowns are lifted, and what will return to quote unquote normal? And what do the experience of the past few months tell us about the potential for changes in response to other threats like climate change? So to answer these questions, we've got a great panel of speakers today, and we'll be speaking about a really broad range of topics within the mobility space. I think that's really exciting. So I'll just introduce them now one by one. First up, we have Kaya Barry from Griffith University. I might get our speakers just to give us a bit of a wave so that the audience knows who they are. Thanks, Kaya. And I'll do a more formal introduction before you speak. We've got David Bissell, University of Melbourne. Yeah. Is Jennifer here yet? Can't tell. I'll keep an eye out. And anyway, Jennifer Bonham from University of Adelaide, Gordon Waite from University of Wollongong, and Robin Dowling from University of Sydney. Thanks, Robin. Great background there. So we'll also be recording the seminar. So hopefully this will allow people who couldn't make it today, or if they're in another time zone and it's very early in the morning, can still see the discussion, and we'll post that on social media and I guess the AusMob site as well, Australian Mobilities Network, which is sponsoring the event. And I guess one thing I'd like to do is to encourage the audience to participate in the discussion as much as you'd like to. So feel free to be active in the chat. I can still see people are posting within the chat, but if there's a point that you'd like to make in the chat or a comment, feel free to post it in the chat. I think that is one way that we can kind of interact in this virtual format that we can't do as easily in a traditional seminar format. So be nice in the comments, they're not moderated in any way. But yeah, if you feel as though there's a paper that might be relevant to a particular point in the discussion, even if it's your own paper, feel free to post it there so that anyone who's interested can follow up on it. So as far as format goes, each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes initially, and then we'll have some freewheeling discussion amongst the panel members for about 20 minutes after that, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience in the time remaining. So if you have a question, just hold on to it until the Q&A, and then once we go to that questions, perhaps I'll get you to type question type a question into the chat with question in all caps so I can see it, and then I might get people to unmute their mic and they can ask the panel the question that they'd like to. Okay, so with that, we'll get started. So we'll have Kaya Barry, is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research at Griffith University. And Kaya is going to be speaking about sharing 1.5 metres, exploring the immobilities of temporary migrants and working holiday makers and the inadequate planning of social/physical distancing for people in shared accommodation. So Kaya's going to share her screen now, I believe, and take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just figure out how to share this screen. Okay, I think, can you see big orange screen? Yeah?
Looks good, yeah.
Good. All right. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking today about this idea of sharing 1.5 meters distance. So at 9 p.m. on Friday, 20th of March, the Australian borders closed, sealing out potential new waves of infections, but also sealing in over 1.2 million temporary migrant workers. The pandemic has magnified the importance of mobilities, in particular the micro, the personal and individual and everyday context of movement. Such close scrutiny and governance has forced us all to question how, where and why people manoeuvre themselves in public, but also in private spaces. So for most of us, we see and hear instructions of keeping 1.5 metre distance, of vigilantly queuing on clearly marked floor stickers in the supermarket, or carefully turning away from others to catch our sneeze in the crook of our elbow, or just simply staying at home. And we have adhered accordingly. But what about for those people who don't have homes to shelter in place in? What about those who share their space with many others? How does 1.5 metres distance then feel to them? So this is the situation faced by many temporary visa holders, those on seasonal work contracts, farm workers, particularly the working holiday maker backpackers, and the Pacific Labour Scheme participants. These are people who are now effectively stuck here in Australia, sealed in by the halt of global mobilities. But there are local immobilities that have brought the scales of personal movement and space into new thresholds. So today I'm just going to briefly sketch out some of the mobile and spatial dilemmas of adhering to even the most basic instruction of keeping 1.5 metre distance. Now, my current postdoc research focuses mainly on backpackers, the working holiday makers who come from 44 different nations. And in the last year, up until the pandemic, there were around 200,000 new visas granted in this scheme. As the media has reported to us over the last few months, these are the backpackers who are the carefree partygoers. They crowd out the beachfronts along Bondi and Kilda. But I'm interested in how their experiences are indicative of the struggle with keeping distance, adhering to 1.5 metres distance when your personal space and mobility is also shared with many others. And during this pandemic, how they've been rendered effectively immobile in their place through inadequate governance of shared accommodation. So while I'm talking today on working holiday makers, their experience of the pandemic restrictions in Australia is largely indicative of many other temporary visa holders. So in late March, the nation was outraged by this spectacle of backpackers who are partying and crowding beachfronts. But the issue is that for some, and of course not all, these large groups that were supposedly in breach of health advice were all technically now considered a household. In Victoria, the health advice for people in temporary shared accommodation, which includes tourist hostels, backpacker and seasonal worker hostels, was, and I quote, "If you're currently in a hostel, you should regard it as your home for the purposes of the stay-at-home direction. You may leave the hostel to board a flight out of Australia. Always observe physical distancing requirements within the hostel." Now, I spoke recently with a backpacker who'd been living in a hostel, or staying in a hostel, in Melbourne CBD during the initial lockdown. He explained to me that, quote, "We all live together. There's 12 in a room, so we're now all roommates. We can go to the shops, to the beach, for a walk, and it looks like we're having a big party, but that's just our room." So most hostels, whether for tourists, for backpackers or for farm workers, they consist of dormitory rooms, kind of like you can see here, where there's bunk beds crowded together, sharing with up to 24 people and sometimes even more. This has become the new household for each dorm room, its own petri dish, as the media kept telling us. Now, in early April, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer was asked during a press conference about people living in shared houses and hostels and whether they should be practicing social distancing. He replied, "Communal living is a challenge in these situations. It's much more challenging to have this social distancing thing, but there are very practical things that can be done, such as coming into the kitchen at different times." Now, Queensland Health guidelines for hostels was to assign guests to a household unit of no more than 4 persons, who will then work, transport and share facilities together, but then keep 1.5 metre distance from all other guests at all times. I spoke to a hostel manager here in Queensland who was struggling to adhere to the state government regulations. Hostels in Queensland were suggested to implement rostered times for access to communal spaces, such as the kitchen, the bathrooms, the toilets, and the laundry. Common recreation areas, so like the courtyard, a smoking area, a swimming pool, or even a TV lounge, were all initially closed and blocked off. Everyone was allocated a time slot to use facilities, and if you missed it, too bad. It was recommended, based on the 4 square metre rule, that this would mean no more than 2 people in the kitchen at a time. But this hostel has 150 working backpackers in it. So even though these new micro households had been established, these new mobilities conflicted with others sharing the same space. But people still needed to come and go for their work each day, to go grocery shopping. So you can imagine the networks of movement that would occur across 150 people, divided down into 4 people units, in addition to around 8 staff members who come in and out of the hostel each day. Imagine if there was an outbreak. In late March, the government had suggested that there were plenty of jobs picking fruit out west for newly unemployed Aussies. This was prior to their announcement of the JobKeeper and increasing payments for the job seeker. The result was, in many regional areas, a backlash against temporary migrant workers as people were desperate for work. Speaking with support organisations who facilitate consulate assistance and travel advice to internationals in regional areas, there were many reports and calls for assistance and emergency response as people were, quote, being thrown off farms in favour of locals. Backpackers were spat on in the street, they were verbally abused, and with internal travel halted in many states, people without their own car were actually unable to leave these regional towns. Now, I just want to remind you all that there are 44 different nations that participate in this scheme. These are not all white Europeans. So one person I spoke to quite recently, he was saying how lucky he was to be in a really good hostel on a nice farm with his close friends. He's earning $500 a week, but his hostel dorm costs him $220. But he can't go anywhere to spend the money because there's no transport, so he's lucky. So just to try and tie all these different ideas and reflections together, the way that mobilities have been governed and regulated here in Australia have so far obviously paid off, and I don't want to detract from that. But this has been at great cost to many. This practice of keeping 1.5 metre distance, it works well for the majority, but it's been inadequately considered for those who are more mobile, or who live in communal situations. Now, I haven't even got to mentioning, as we all know, the international students who are queuing up for food vouchers, or the refugees who are desperately protesting for protection due to their high-risk health conditions that are now exacerbated by inadequate shared accommodation in detention. But this has all been a mobility or an immobility that's been framed on this stay or leave debate, based on an elusive airline ticket to depart, and of course, a place to return to. The scales of immobilities, they range from the global to the local, but we can think about this much closer, from the individual and personal right down to the viral. So in an article I've just published the other week that examines the instructional diagrams of the pandemic, I've suggested that even these simple instructions, such as the 1.5 metre distancing, it complicates existing mobility inequalities. We must question how certain instructions might amplify feelings of unease and guilt, or worse, open provisions for discipline that produce even further spatial injustices. It isn't just these big border closures, this halt of global immobility that impacts temporary migrants. And that's happening here, but also elsewhere in the world. It's smaller things like this new norm of social distancing and movements from others. But this, of course, is only possible for those who have the safety and security and a home, those who belong and are not considered temporary. These micro scales of regulating mobilities, enacted through these everyday restrictions and guidelines of instructing how and where people should move and whom they're permitted to move with, are very challenging, especially as it appears there's no end in sight. That's all. Thank you. Right. Stop sharing.
Great. Thanks, Kaya. That was awesome. Yeah, really good. Really great insights. And it really does show just how, in some ways, how privileged one can be to be able to be in a position to take it to perform that 1.5 meters. You know, it is easy for some people who have the kind of resources and the capital to be able to do that. But as you say, there are a lot of people and groups who it's just not viable for them. So excellent. Okay, thank you. We'll now go to our next speaker, which is David. So David Bissell is Associate Professor and Future Fellow in the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. And David will be exploring the perils and opportunities of disorientation brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the vulnerability and politics of exposure experienced by mobile workers. So take it away, David.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you again for bringing us together in this discussion. I'm really excited to hear from you at the end, actually, a little bit more about your work currently in this space around digital conferencing skills. And also thanks to everyone for joining in this discussion. As Andrew said, like it's, you know, another Zoom symposium is maybe the kind of last thing that people want to do, you know, 3 months in and on a Friday afternoon. But it's brilliant to see that we've got people joining us from overseas, from New Zealand, from Hong Kong, from Korea. So thank you very much. And just to underline Andrew's point, please do contribute to the discussion later on after we've given our provocations. I'm really excited to hear your contributions. So yeah, look, I really just want to kind of riff on two themes that Andrew's just flagged. And the first of those is around uncertainty. And as Simone's already just put in the chat window, you know, uncertainty does seem to be the theme of the day, with certainly in Australian higher education, with the changes the government's proposed to undergrad funding. But it's a theme that I've been interested in developing in recent work with Andrew Gorman-Murray and Libby Strawn on our project on mobile workers. So these are people who work away from home for months or weeks at a time. So some interesting overlaps, I guess, there with Kaya's brilliant intervention just then. Just to say though, the more that we got into this literature, I guess the more troubled that we were that quite a lot of the mobilities literature claims to basically kind of know what's going on. You might be thinking, oh, you know, surely that's our role to point out what's going on. And I guess, yeah, in part it is. But I guess we were also troubled with this idea of the theorist as the kind of knowing revealer. because the more that we engaged with our transcripts, our data with mobile workers and their partners, the more we realized that the data were kind of studded with all kinds of disconnections, uncertainties, experiences of just not knowing, of not being sure, of hesitation, and of doubt. And I guess we realized that a lot of these things tend to get written out of analysis in favor of the more definite things that we can say stuff about. So the relations, the connections between people and places. And so to that end, in our publications, we've been quite interested in thinking about how things like disorientation, confusion, incomprehension are as much a part of our mobile worlds as those things that actually kind of orient us, that we can say something definitely about. I guess our point is that these are not necessarily negative things to erase. They're a part of everyday life, and they provide us with a more vulnerable mobile figure. Conceptually, I guess we think that these are significant because they provide a critique of a lot of the strongly relational theories that have become really prominent across the social sciences of late. So from active network theory, new materialism, even affect theory, there's a real focus on interrelation and entanglement that privileges relations. And we think that this actually overlooks disconnection, gaps, absences, those things that are a really fundamental part of our life worlds. I should also just say this is not just us that are saying this or doing this. There's been some really fantastic work being done by, I'm thinking Ainsley Hughes in geography at Newcastle, who is exploring experiences of being lost, for example, in her PhD research. And I'd really encourage you to engage with her work and her joint work with Kathy Mee. There's a really great Geography Compass article on the topic of being lost that I think was published in 2017. So I guess the reason I'm introducing this theme is that I think disorientation feels pretty key to what we might be feeling at the moment. So especially how COVID-19 has changed our own mobile lives. Our daily routines have changed, of course they have, and our sense of place might have changed in subtle but significant ways. And I guess also it's really unnerving to feel such disorientation, especially in places that should feel so familiar and apparently known. It's been really interesting reading accounts of plane travel of late and public transport during this time that have really foregrounded this sense of uncertainty, this heightened nervousness. And again, I think there's a tendency sometimes to want to remove those things or to remove the disorientations. You know, they're profoundly uncomfortable. They're hard to narrate also, so there's methodological issues there. But I think there are important reasons to hang on to these somewhat wobbly, disoriented experiences in this COVID-19 time. So in part, I think this is about admitting that it's actually really difficult to know what's going on. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, it presumes that before COVID, we did know with some certainty what was going on, but was that really the case? So as my first point, I'm interested in asking, what do experiences like disorientation, confusion, and incomprehension do? What sort of practices do they give rise to? What new sorts of questions do they provoke? What sort of ethical responses do they call for? And what sort of relations do they set up? So rather than proclaiming mobile life is changing this way or that, and there's been a lot of kind of loud declarations being made of late, interesting and provocative, of course, my first point is really just to underline the productive political potentials of hanging on to this sense of impasse, a space of uncertainty where maybe new questions actually become permitted and you know, allowed to be debated rather than quickly closed down. So this just leads on to my second theme. This underplayed idea of disorientation leads to what I'd like to touch on in terms of vulnerability. And of course, I'm raising this theme because, as Kaya's presentation beautifully illustrated, you know, COVID-19 has really heightened the idea that to be mobile at this time is to be vulnerable. And of course, in this case, it's about exposure to the virus. Now, of course, exposure has been a really key theme of mobility studies. So the idea that when we move, we encounter all manner of things, people, objects, and the environments that we move through. And this might even be the reason for travel, that we might be changed in some way by these encounters. And again, I'm thinking of Kaya's excellent work on the materialities of travel, Ben Iaquinto's work on backpackers here too. But I guess what I'm interested in thinking about here is loops into Mimi Scheller's concept of mobility justice, in that it feels like there's a new politics of exposure that might be interesting to think about. So in terms of those who can engineer and manage certain kinds of exposure, and those who can't, those people who have to endure what they are exposed to. Again, there is a long history of work on urban mobility and beyond, on those who can separate themselves out into bubbled existences where environments are kind of conditioned. And I think Robin is going to be talking to this point a little bit more later on. But I wonder whether COVID-19 changes our understanding of the politics of mobility in terms of differential exposure. So again, remembering here that our privileged immobility as we work from home is contingent on a massive number of key workers and others who are forced to be mobile. So logistics workers, healthcare workers, supermarket workers, taxi, rideshare drivers, FIFO workers who continue in the resources sector at this time. So how does this map onto and accentuate all kinds of divisions, class divisions possibly, as the immobility of working from home becomes a privilege that's only afforded to those in traditionally white-collar jobs? But I guess my final point here is perhaps more than this, maybe from a more pedagogical perspective. And again, I felt that this was a really interesting theme in Kaya's presentation. How might our own heightened vulnerabilities in transit create new kinds of connections, new kinds of empathy, however small, with mobile populations whose exposure to hardships is an endemic feature of their mobility? You know, the undocumented migrant, the asylum seeker, the refugee. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that there's any form of kind of crass correlation between such vastly different experiences, but I do think that there might be some interesting political potentials in the heightened awareness of bodily vulnerability on the move. And looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that towards the end, maybe. Thanks, that's all from me. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing what others have to say.
Great, David. Thank you so much. That was really excellent. Certainly, I've been thinking about how there's just been this inversion of mobility capital, I guess, which we talked a lot about for network capital. People who are on the move were the ones who are in sort of privileged, high status positions, and that really has just changed dramatically, and to the point that you don't want to be anywhere near a lot of those. You don't want to be performing those high mobility practices if you value health. So excellent, thanks so much. We will move on to the next speaker, which is Jennifer. So Jennifer, she is here. I think I did see that she had arrived. Great. So Jennifer Bonham is Senior Lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Adelaide. And Jennifer will be discussing the patchy responses to people's changing mobility during COVID-19, investments for future mobility, the difficulties in lasting change, thinking about what's happening going forward, and potential new directions for research that have emerged during the pandemic. So Jennifer, take it away.
Jennifer, you need to unmute. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Okay, so basically my PowerPoint is really to keep me on track. I'm looking at urban mobility and sort of equitable and environmentally responsible journeys, and hence the 4 dot points that Andrew provided. What I've done is I've actually contracted that down to 2 because covering all 4 was going to be a bit of a challenge. So I want to talk about stubborn concepts and categories, and this is something that I have been thinking about for some time with colleagues Carol Back and Stephanie Doerr, and the new directions that we might take with urban mobility research. So in terms of stubborn concepts and categories, I think COVID-19 has been really useful in bringing to the fore the many meanings of our mobility, and particularly health and sociality and being integrated into our neighbourhood, and the importance of our mobility for all of those things. And they can tend to be subsumed under the notion that our mobility is simply about transport. And I work between transport studies, road safety studies, and these multiple meanings of our mobility still get lost in this overwhelming transport understanding of our mobility. And of course, we don't have mobility departments, we have transport departments. So we continue to see our mobility in these terms, or our governments do, our authorities do, who govern our mobility. So it's been, I think, really important the way in which our COVID-19 has brought to the fore the importance of health and sociality in looking at our mobility through the urban environment. So people not using their cars, being at home, working from home, as David says, but also recognising that our mobility is fundamental to our health. So people out there riding bikes, scootering, skateboarding, walking, and so on. So while we've got that on the one hand, we still have a whole field of transport that focuses on specific modes, and in particular often talks about conflict between those modes. So we have systematic data collection still on the private automobile. We have, you know, huge amounts of data and knowledge produced about movements by private automobile and by public transport, largely as an adjunct to that private automobile. So this is the context. So here we are trying to, trying to argue for new forms of mobility out of COVID-19, and yet we still are in, most of our knowledge is based in private automobile and public transport knowledge. Walking and cycling are relegated to local journeys. So while there's been lots of observations about all these people out walking, bike shops doing a roaring trade in selling bicycles, we actually have some records of where people are cycling. So there is some in some cities like Melbourne, in Perth, here in Adelaide to a much lesser extent. We have some idea about how those journeys have changed. In Perth, they've trebled. In Melbourne, it's very interesting to see the way in which there's been an increase in number of journeys by bike across the day. But nonetheless, walking and cycling is still relegated, and cycling in particular, to local journeys, and we don't have systematic, our government, our authorities don't have systematic data collection around cycling, so we still really don't know very much about how people use these journeys. Scootering, skateboarding, wheelchair use are almost invisible in transport. Of course, in terms of wheelchair use and gopher use, we actually have, you know, roads being redesigned to enable these users to use the roads more easily. But pretty much, you know, we still don't know very much. Within our transport departments, these aren't really on the radar. They're largely invisible. In the road safety literature and driver licensing processes, and this is where my work has been for the last 5 years, thinking about how we produce spaces through the road safety literature itself and driver licensing processes itself. And pedestrians, which include scooter riders and skateboarders and wheelchair users, cyclists and children, these categories of people, they're constituted as hazards. So they're abnormalised in relation to the driver. At the very moment people start getting their driver licence, they abnormalise these other road users. So within the work I've been doing, I've been trying to think about other directions in our research and how we might actually try to produce a more equitable interactions between our road users. And here I draw on Anne-Marie Moll's work, where she talks about our research methods producing different versions of reality. So rather than being a window into reality, they produce these different versions of reality, and then coordinating practices that position one particular version of reality as the version, as the truth about our reality. So working with Moll's work in the background, Susan Fraser has argued that we should be researching new realities into existence. So if our research methods produce versions of reality, then why not start thinking about producing or researching new realities into existence? And so this is the kind of thinking where Carol and Stephanie and I are kind of at. It's, okay, how do we apply this within mobility, within urban mobility? And we're thinking, okay, so we kind of need new concepts and invent new mobile subjects. Of course, we can't just say anything. We're still constrained and limited by our disciplines. So we can't just stand up there and say anything we like. We kind of have to push the boundaries, I suppose, or sort of punch holes in those boundaries. So in terms of enabling post-COVID, in terms of enabling people to cycle and scooter and skate around our cities, rather than thinking about these road users as hazards, rather than thinking about the relations between different modes as conflict, does the concept of traffic participation help us? So if we think about traffic participation, then our participants are all engaged in an endeavour. So it might be very naive, but hopefully this kind of common endeavour generates possibilities for respect between different road users and accommodating them rather than seeing them as things in the way to be moved out of the way. So how do we go about researching that? I think the concept, it's a neat start. We've got the start. Traffic participation, where do we go with that? And the next step is saying, okay, so what methods do we need to use? What research methods are going to help us to actually explore traffic participation and to generate a new participatory kind of urban mobility? So here, we've also started to think about new categories of road users. So we've got very hard categories of drivers and cyclists and skateboarders and public transport users and pedestrians. And at any one moment, depending on your primary mode at that moment, you are that thing, you are that subject. But we know that lots of drivers are also cyclists. So can we start to put those categories together and just disrupt the conflict between them? Because, while we might argue with ourselves, I often argue with myself, so while we might do that, really, if you're out there on the road and you're thinking, I'm a driver cyclist, doesn't make it so easy then to have a conflictual relation with another driver cyclist. For those people who are, walk to the local public transport stop, if we don't call them pedestrians at one point and public transport users at another, if we call them public transport pedestrians, what does that enable in terms of how do we investigate those people? How do we actually start doing research on them? And then what does that open up in terms of the possibilities we might have for bringing these new existences into effect? And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I really like that idea of thinking about this as a point in time in which the road space is really sort of up for grabs in some ways in terms of how we think about road use, different modes of transport. breaking down those sort of defined categories that we've sort of been working in. So fantastic. And I think Gordon will actually be speaking to that a little bit as well in his discussion about about cycling. So with that, I will move on to Gordon, who's next up. Gordon Waite is Professor in the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities at the University of Wollongong, and he's going to be speaking about how cycling in the city of Sydney took on a position of prominence during the pandemic and offered a moment to repurpose roads, but also increase encouragement to use private vehicles instead of public transport. So looking forward, Gordon will be asking what it would take to repurpose roads, not just in pandemic times, but at all times. So Gordon, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everyone. I titled my 10-minute piece here, Sensations from the Saddle. And I'd like to begin just by acknowledging country and reflecting in particular on the importance of the Illawarra Escarpment and the ocean in sustaining me through this pandemic. There's two parts to my presentation. I'm going to begin with some observations from Sydney around cycling, and then I'm going to move to some reflections from the field. And the materials that I draw upon are from a larger ARC project titled Pedaling for Change. And here I'd like to acknowledge Tess Lee, Anna Lewis, Teresa Harada, as well as Ian Buchanan, Glenn Fuller, and Nick Fogarty, and the collaborations with the City of Sydney Council itself. So let me begin by some observations from Sydney. So bikes were positioned in prominence during the lockdown measures of March and April. Bikes became a legitimate form of mobility, particularly for leisure and deliveries. In the City of Sydney, bike counts increased in April 2020 by 51% along the Glebe foreshore to around 5,000 in comparison to the same week in 2019, and some 25% along Burke Street in Redfern to over 10,000 rides. While on Kent Street in the city, there was a fall of 10% on the same weeks in the previous years, but still in excess of 7,000 counts. And counts of cars fell by around about 80%. At the same time, cycling advocacy groups were mobilized to reduce the speed limits to 30 kilometers an hour with the aim of keeping cyclists involved in accidents out of intensive care. As we've heard, bicycle shops could not keep up with demand. Bicycle shops reported that they had never traded as well in March and April 2020. Forgotten bikes were resurrected from under the stairs and rescued from garden sheds. State governments allocated funding to fast track the rollout of cycling infrastructure, and the City of Sydney announced the building of 6 new cycle links. As part of the COVID-19 planning, parks cars were banished from Centennial Park at weekends. The pandemic seemed to offer a glimpse into the repurposing for roads for bikes. Yet, the prominence of the bike all changed from May 2020 as lockdown measures relaxed. As we've heard, health messages discouraged the use of public transport. Possibilities of cycling as an intermodal form of transport are constrained, given that the capacity of public transport was cut by 30 to 50% to maintain the physical distancing measures. Prior to the pandemic, parts of the Sydney network operated at over 180%. At the same time, the private car was positioned as a COVID-19 safer option, and our counts of cars tell us that the car is returning to the roads of the city of Sydney. Indeed, as part of the New South Wales government's COVID-19 transport plan, temporary parking arrangements were made in Moore Park on the showground fields for people to park free and who could drive to work. So the questions that we're interested in, one of the questions that we're interested in is, what would it take to encourage cycling in Sydney, not only in pandemic times, but all times? Is building cycle lanes sufficient to encourage the uptake of cycling for transport? So with these two questions, I'd like to just begin with some reflections from the field work that we've conducted. Policy tends to ignore or underplay the importance of understanding the actual experience of cycling, and this is what Jennifer was pointing out. One of our research with cyclists is to address this gap. We're arguing that an embodied understanding of mobility justice operates by inquiring how individuals negotiate, assume, or deny related and sometimes conflicting mobility subjectivities of the cyclist and driver. We're interested in better understanding where and when do cyclists feel in the right to ride a bike or not. And I offer 4 dot point reflections from the field work that began in 2019 with 50 cyclists who participated in sensory cycling ethnographies. So first, mobility justice. Our interviews make it clear that people cycle because it feels right to do so, more precisely because they feel in the right to do so, and not as a rational response to education policies which advocate healthy or sustainable cities. On the same token, people are inhibited from cycling because they are made to feel that they have no right to do so, that they're in the wrong in the same spaces available to them. So this is also there's also a gendered sense of entitlement. The second point is around territory. What struck us about participants' narratives was the importance of territory in negotiating mobility justice. The road is experienced as the domain of the car. So such thinking is illustrated by participants telling us about positioning themselves at the margins of the road or off the road altogether and being categorized as a nuisance. In doing so, they effectively legitimate the predatory behavior of the larger vehicles. The third point was around love. There's a very specific geography to cycling, which is about finding a place for life, love, and self-care in time-squeezed and pressured working lives. There are many kinds of love for cycling. Love of cycling helps stabilizes who is deemed to be in and out of place on roads and cycleways by configuring territories in groups of outsiders, insiders. Love doesn't equal mobility justice. Fissures appear within cycling styles. The idea is exploded that cyclists can be approached as a unitary collective. Mobility injustices are expressed spatially through love-hate bonds. What love of cycling does is intensify a sense of self and builds territories through addictive capacities operating in all of us. And finally, personal space that touches back on what David and Kea were talking about. And here we're very much interested in the ways that bodies experience and make sense of and perceive physical proximity between cyclists and other occupants of their environment, and the potential antagonistic experiential relationships that emerge between the corporeal movement of a particular cycling style and occupants of footpath, roads and cycleways. And this we think might be key to helping explaining the resistance for cycling for transport. What is important to understand, though, that is while the distance can be measured, they're not extrinsic. Rather, they arrived at subjectively as a matter of feeling and affect. For some cyclists, the mandated 1 meter gap for passing cars is sufficient. For others, it feels terrifyingly like a close encounter with death. And the idea of personal space and proximity seems to be heightened with all the COVID measures. So, being unconventional, I'm going to start with beginnings as a conclusion, and I suppose it's also an invitation, because I'm still looking for some answers. We're currently recruiting people who bought a bike or dusted down their bike and started riding in the city of Sydney since the start of the pandemic. And we're interested in learning what mobilized this change to shed insights on the thresholds of cycling in the city and better understand how to keep people in the saddle. Thank you, Andrew.
Great, Gordon. Thanks very much. Yeah, I really like that point you made about how the speed limits were reduced to ensure that there would be less cyclists going into intensive care, right? And I think it's just a really interesting example of how sort of policies in one area can affect other policies in a completely different area, and we really need to pay attention to those kind of connections which might not always be expected. So, fantastic, thank you. I will move on to our last speaker. Last but certainly not least is Robin Dowling. So, Professor in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. And Robin will be discussing how the pandemic has impacted the transport sharing economy in terms of ride-sharing apps like Uber, GoGet and so on, and bike or scooter sharing applications, and how the pandemic challenges these forms of sharing. So take it away, Robin.
Great. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the organisation of a very timely conversation about what in my head is post-pandemic mobility. I guess I'd like to begin though by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm speaking today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And pay my respect to elders past and present. And I'd also like to say, when I did write those notes, I was going to talk about shared mobility in general. I'm actually going to just talk about one, but that will become apparent, because shared mobility has become one of the transport success stories of the past 10 years. So as travellers eschewed individual ownership of cars or bikes, for example, for forms of transport that were owned by others, so mobility as a service. But not all shared mobility is the same. And there's a checkered pattern of success, as most of us would know, across Australian cities. So, for example, globally successful share bikes, there's been multiple efforts to introduce share bikes into Sydney by different corporations, and still have limited traction. And in fact, one of the scenes of isolation of the past 10 to 12 weeks in Sydney has been forlorn share bikes in various parts of the city. But car sharing has a bit of a different trajectory, and that's what I'm going to talk about and what I'm most familiar with. So the use of cars by members, GoGet being the classic one in the Australian case, cars booked online and you get billed for time. So the replacement of car ownership by car access in certain parts of Australian cities has been surprisingly successful. So from a zero base in 2001, essentially, the cities of Melbourne and Sydney continued to record dramatic growth in the number of people using shared cars, as well as the number of car share cars. So in the city of Sydney alone, where I'm located, more than 50,000 people are members of a car share organisation. The city of Sydney is not a particularly populous place, and car share cars remain common sight. But car share use plummeted during the pandemic-related shutdowns across the world. So in some parts of the world, such as London, the shutdown of car sharing was mandated for safety reasons, albeit temporarily. In places such as Milan, for example, car share use declined by 25% in 1 week in late February, and 2 months later was still 90% below usual usage. So this afternoon, I'm going to briefly canvass the reasons for this decline, but in parallel, imagine what type of bounce back for car sharing, to use that terrible language, what sort of bounce back might we expect in Australian cities? Now, the obvious reason for declining car share use relates to perceptions of safety. So as COVID-19 and fears of infection spread, cleanliness and hygiene became ever more paramount. So while car sharers are not sitting next to strangers like they may be on public transport, they are using surfaces touched and inhabited by others. And my own research, conducted a few years ago now, identified that concerns about other people's stuff being left in cars, about dirt, about mess, were prominent for many car sharers. So if you put these perceptions and you layer them on top of COVID-related hygiene fears, then it seems pretty clear that car sharing as usually practiced became far less attractive during the past 12 weeks, really. But the picture's a little bit more complicated than cleanliness and concerns about transmission of COVID-19. So one of the things that mobility researchers, including those in the AusMob group, have consistently identified is that mobility is a social practice as much as a means of getting from A to B or a physical infrastructure. So it's more than the physical means of transport. And it's in thinking of mobility and car sharing in particular as a practice, which I've done a lot of, we can see some further insight into what happened and then what post-pandemic car sharing may look like, assuming that that's where we might want to return to. And essentially the pandemic disrupted reasons for travel, and the types of journeys most disrupted were actually the ones conventionally associated with car sharing. So we know, the research I've done, that car sharing is used principally for social and recreational use. It's used for shopping, for nights out, for picnics, for visiting friends and family, for ferrying children to sport, to music lessons and the like. So for families, for example, car share cars are often the second car, and during the pandemic, the activities that required a second car simply weren't happening. So for young and old, visiting families and friends was prohibited, as were most types of social outings. Day trips out of Sydney, to be very Sydney-centric for a while, to holiday on the coast was designated illegal and subject to the imposition of fines. So while cleanliness was a factor in car sharing, the reason for travel was really important. So as Australian cities emerge out of their constrained lockdowns, car share and ride share, though that's a different matter we might want to take up in the discussion, so are returning to service levels, the returning service, along the way emphasising heightened attention to cleaning and all those other things that we hear about in relation to public transport and a whole series of different forms of transport. I'm interested in what might a return look like, because we know from mobility studies that seemingly minor disruptions can create a change in transport practices. So transport's habitual, and when habits are broken by an external force like the pandemic, do they return? How then might the major disruption of the pandemic impact a return to normal car share use? Might there be a new normal? And what factors might shape that new normal? So in the rest, what I've got left is, I will be quick, to offer a couple of speculative answers to these questions, things that I've been thinking about. First, and this is drawing on some work I did with Jen Kent, is that it's really important to understand that car sharing relies upon and reproduces the geography of public transport. So car sharing actually works because it's a complement to other alternatives to the private car. And this comes back to Jennifer Bonnan's point recently about how we need to, just that she made today, about we need to think about people that are pedestrians and drivers and cyclists all at once. Because car sharing only makes sense as a part of a wider transport package. The transit, walking, cycling are all viable options, and then accessing a car fills the gaps between those options. It needs high residential and commercial densities, a good pedestrian environment, a cycling environment, and really good, reliable networks of public transport to help car sharing succeed. So the extent and speed with which public transport networks and usage are re-established will actually be a very important influence on the return or not of people to car sharing. And second, car sharing relies on the provision of parking on street or off street. Again, drawing on some work I did with Jen. Without a guaranteed place to find the car share car, confidence in the system is reduced. The car share parking, particularly on street, has long been controversial in terms of giving exclusive access to public road space to a private corporation, and also in the taking away of parking spaces for more general or resident use. And post-pandemic planning responses are likely to make parking even more valuable and politically contested. I'm thinking here of the designation that Gordon alluded to, the designation of additional cycleways in the cities of Sydney and Melbourne and worldwide, which have already brought to the fore in Sydney at least an ongoing debate between cyclists and parking. And car share parking is likely to be further embroiled in these conversations that might impact what its future might look like in the city. And third, as recreational and social journeys increase across the city, car sharing's core transport needs, or what it meets, will re-emerge. Junior sport is returning across the country, gatherings of larger groups at home are permitted, restaurants and hotels are reopening. And indeed, it may be the fact that because car sharing does not cater to the journey to work, might end up being a benefit in light of the predictions of a longer-term resurgence in working from home. So car sharing won't be as impacted as, say, public transport from the working from home movement. But mitigating this, however, is the continued absence of two core groups of car share users, students and visitors. And I completely acknowledge that this is a very big Sydney, Melbourne centric perspective where we've had large concentrations of international students and large concentrations of visitors. Because while borders, both national and international, remain closed, the number of potential car sharers actually remains much smaller than it was pre-pandemic. So, to briefly conclude, so while I've focused on car sharing today, it's really not the specific details that I want to emphasise. I just find it interesting to think through. Well, I just wanted to draw attention to the importance, as all the panellists have really said today, of thinking more holistically about transport and the ways that post-pandemic transport patterns will emerge through the overlap of COVID-specific concerns, through habits of behaviour and the social practices that transport serves. And that future we can't really predict, obviously, at the moment, but I really look forward to seeing how it emerges over the next few years. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin. That's fantastic. Yeah, really, I guess in some ways unexpected. And I think what you were talking about, how car users are again, not just car sharing users aren't just a distinct category. As you said, they are often also private car users. They're also public transport users, often in the same journey. I can imagine people catching public transport and car sharing in the same journeys. So really interesting to think about. So so that concludes the formal presentation aspect of the seminar. We now have some time for discussion and Q&A. We will be finishing at 2 o'clock, so we've got about just over 20 minutes. I think we could probably actually start. I'm just looking at the questions in the chat, and I think Pauline McGurk has posted just a great way to start an open discussion about thinking about how we embrace this moment of uncertainty and reorientation, and how we might sort of move through that without immediately just going for solutions. So how do we kind of take advantage of the moment of uncertainty and openness before being squeezed by demands for solutions, which inevitably will be kind of framed in, I guess, most likely pre-pandemic terms. David, perhaps do you want to sort of lead that?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Pauline. It's a great question. And in fact, I was reflecting on the higher education announcements today, and I think my frustration and my kind of sadness was it felt like we kind of pivoted, to use that awful word, from this kind of time of sort of genuinely national government around issues, and we kind of slid back into old habits, as you say, into kind of this re-emergence of ideological governance. and government. And so I suppose, thinking at that point alone, I really do think there is a lot of potential in extending the kind of not knowing, extending the disorientation. And my quick answer to that, because I don't want to hog space, is that I think as researchers, we kind of have a role in creating, I suppose, a kind of existential space through the words that we use, through the grammars and vocabularies and modes of expression that we use to set up the kinds of question and narrate our fieldwork. So even saying something like a simple statement like, "This is not a normal situation," suddenly creates an existential territory that allows certain sorts of questions to emerge. So again, it's really kind of subtle but really powerful things like that, that especially in kind of more policy settings can have a really marked effect. But of course, there might be other sorts of expressions, expressive things that we do as well that also serve to extend disorientation. So it might be stories that remind us of disorientation, stories that kind of plunge us into some of those new realities, new wobbles that we might have experienced. And again, stories are something that in policy circles are something that a lot of people are really amenable to. Stories that disorient, stories that suggest that what people want is not clear. I think there is some really exciting potential there.
Any of the other panel members like to contribute to that? Gordon, yes, go for it.
Just building on David's comment there, and I'm thinking about creative practices and the importance of disorientation amongst artists in providing inspiration. So there is real value in disorientation and disruption. I'm just mindful, though, that we can't let in too much disorientation. We can't let in too much uncertainty, because I think that's when our lives fall towards the often too, I'm hearing it through my own students and the teaching I'm doing, and the horrific incidents of suicide and depression. So whilst I'm mindful of the possibilities of disorientation and the use that it can do in thinking creatively, I think we also have to be alert that too much disorientation, too much uncertainty also has implications.
Sure, Teresa.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really thought-provoking stuff from everyone. I just wanted to point out that we're talking about this as being not normal and being a period of disorientation, but I just wanted to point out that the people that I've been working with, people with disabilities who, for them, this is the normal. They're confined to home. Their transport options are very limited. People who live in social housing, low SES, can't afford to be mobile. For them, the pandemic hasn't really been anything out of the normal. This is, hasn't impacted on their way of life, but I think for us, it's a really great opportunity to start a discussion about all the concerns that we have about how mobility impacts on our social interactions and our mental health. And these are issues that are just kind of passed over for people who don't have that same access to mobility that we do.
It's a great point, yeah, and I think that certainly ties into to Jennifer's point about sort of researching new realities into resistance, and taking this as an opportunity to really open up the space of the intellectual space around mobilities to understand people's different realities. That, as you say, not everyone is experiencing this pandemic in the same way by any means. So we certainly shouldn't be assuming that. Did anyone else have anything to say about that, or we might go to another question? I realise we've sort of skipped over the end. I can't see everyone at the moment. I can see, I think, about half of you at a time, so it's difficult for me to just unmute yourself. I think we can just go with people just unmuting themselves, and if you speak over each other for a second, it's not too bad. But speak up if you'd like to contribute to that point. Otherwise, we can go to another question. Okay, so we might go to a question from, I believe it's Ben Quinto, who's got a question for Kaya. And this sort of does touch on some of the things we were talking about earlier. Ben's asked, are there any backpackers and or tourists in the hostels, or are they all temporary migrant workers? And then, are those categories even meaningful anymore? All right, so again, there's this sort of disruption of categories.
There are some, I haven't done a wide survey. I've just reached out to people I know through existing networks. I mean, there are still tourists here, but most of them, if they haven't left yet, it's because they can't go home for whatever reason, whether that's because there's no connecting flights or the flights are too much. But I think this does, the categories are probably not so meaningful because the backpackers who are on working holiday maker visas, as soon as they step in to do their required work for their visa extension, they become just any other temporary migrant worker with the same limited rights and conditions. But it also, it goes back to what we were just talking about, this new normal, or whether this is new. And for many of these people, this isn't necessarily that new. Not so much for the backpackers, but for particularly Pacific people who participate in similar schemes. And people who are on limited working rights, so some of the asylum seeker visas and some bridging visas. We're now seeing the bridging visas for international students also have similar kinds of limited work rights, so it does limit how and where they can work. So these are, these conditions that I'm talking about, they are kind of these little like micro bubbles of, a few months doing some farm work. But this is ongoing. This has just really extenuated these sorts of conditions and circumstances. So I think, like we were saying, with people who are on the margins and have disadvantages and different sort of social inequalities, this new normal has been relatively normal, and it's us just maybe turning a little more attention to it. And I do like from David's talk when he was talking about Mimi Scheller's, notion of mobility justice, like how might we use this, leverage this increased attention to these injustices, and think about how people are always exposed and vulnerable in these ways in society. I mean, just looking at, the group I'm talking about, we're talking about like 1.2 million people here. It's not just a small group. And that's just the ones with working rights. So you add in the others who don't have working rights and the number's much higher. So I think, this is a really good opportunity, and no matter what the context is, whether it's transport, whether it's housing, whether it's, travel and visa rights, these are all mobility issues that we can leverage this attention a little bit more carefully, I think, rather than just letting it play out in politics up the top. I think as researchers, we're all finding really interesting new habits and new findings that can bring a lot of value to these big decisions that need to be made, because the Australian border is not going to open anytime soon. We know that. We're not going to eradicate the virus here in Australia. It's unlikely that will happen. So this, even just simple social distancing is going to be here for months, if not years to come.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Kaya. That was really interesting. There's a lot of changes that are happening in that space, so I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Yeah. And Candice has made the point that that some things have improved for people with disabilities, as they've now got access to online services that they didn't have before. So I think that sort of ties in with things like increasing the unemployment benefits, you know, and then people are in a much better situation than they were previously, because the pandemic has kind of uncovered all the, and just showed us how starkly these inequalities were, and so we couldn't avoid them anymore, couldn't sweep them under the rug. Anyone else have a question? I've been told that if you use the raise hand feature, you'll go to the top of the list, and it might be easier for me to see your question. But again, I think feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question at this point. I think we're okay with that. Otherwise, I'll go to some of my notes. Okay, well, I thought it was interesting, something again that Kaya said about there were these directives to, I guess, desynchronize people's mobilities within these spaces. So sort of directives from government to try to that people should be moving in and out of rooms or not doing things at the same time as a sort of a solution to dealing with the virus spread, as a way to kind of maintain social distance. And it reminded me of some of the work I've done on energy in the home, where people were sort of given these financial incentives to try to, I guess, disrupt their own sort of habits and rhythms around energy use to try to reduce their energy bills. So they were being kind of encouraged to not use energy at peak times, because that's when energy was the most expensive, and if they reduced it. But of course, energy use around peak times was peak use, not for any random reason, but precisely because it was integrated into people's daily routine so much that those particular activities, like for instance cooking dinner and washing and so on, were all centered around very specific times. And so particularly for I guess households that a lot of households found it quite difficult to just say, well, we can't have dinner at a different time of the day as a way to reduce our energy bills. And it reminded me that those kind of directives, I suppose, weren't really paying attention to people's actual experiences and how difficult that might be, you know, for a lot of people. Just good. We've got about 9 minutes left. So
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
I was just thinking, when you're talking about scheduling, and I'm wondering, because I know, David, you've done some thinking both about disorientation. Sorry, I'll put my video back on. The dog had been annoying. You've been thinking about disorientation, but you've also thought about the rhythms of the city. And what I'm really quite interested in thinking through is that, given in a really simplistic way that there's been a disorientation, and what seems normal is being challenged, and what is old is new, etc., etc. How do you see the rhythms of moving and of mobility changing or altering, or just staying the same in that context?
It's a great question, and I suppose also that it's kind of a methodological question as well, in terms of you know, how can any of us kind of think of, identify, witness these rhythms? You know, is this going to be returning to the sorts of track and trace methodology that some people in mobility studies have used, or is this going to encourage us to use more maybe backward tracing methodologies around people's reflections on this period? I mean, I can imagine that would be a really, really interesting and kind of thoughtful way of maybe trying to gauge the kind of diversity of different rhythms that have emerged in this period, you know, people reflecting on them. But I guess also just, I mean, I was reflecting, one of the points that really struck me about your presentation, Robin, is, and it goes back to my kind of earlier point about, I suppose, different objects of analysis coming to the fore in the pandemic. And you mentioned how you mentioned the phrase, the kind of confidence in the system being reduced. And I thought that was so interesting, because you know, confidence, it's something intangible, it's something that's ephemeral, and yet it's absolutely key to the way that we make sense of and justify our decisions to take particular modes of transport during this time, for example. And so, and it's, you know, so I was kind of interested in actually inviting you maybe to say a little bit more about that idea of confidence, and I suppose how, you know, what informs that. I guess it's quite a, yeah, it's a kind of really tricky sort of intangible objective analysis, but feels really, really fundamental.
And I guess I haven't really thought about it in that way, but again, just to take it a little bit, the interest that it was posed, but confidence used to mean different things than it used to mean certainty. That sounds really, you know, confidence. So, and it's got multiple meanings. So in the case of a car share car, you need to know it's there when you want it to be. But there is this really thing about certainty, and I think that what makes people feel confident about what they're doing is probably mode specific and context specific. So, you know, Gordon was talking about cyclists for whom 1 metre interval between a car is incredibly confidence inducing, and they're very happy with that, whereas others are not. And I think that what we used to be, certain or sure or assured about was being squeezed into a train carriage was not a problem. But it's not necessarily disconnected. It's not necessarily tightly connected to a reality either. It's about what are those things that we want. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
No, thanks. That's great.
And I think those realities can change very quickly depending on the situation with outbreaks and so on. I mean, I can imagine if we maintain a relatively low number of cases with the virus, then those norms around, you know, how many people are we okay with on a bus or a train carriage might stay relatively stable. But if there is an outbreak of some kind, I can imagine things changing very quickly, you know, and not just in terms of, because people were already social distancing before the lockdowns even came, the official directives and the laws sort of came into place. My understanding was that people were already kind of withdrawing and starting to avoid public transport and so on before there were actual directives from the government saying, health advice saying, don't do this. And so there is another kind of level that we need to understand about this beyond just what was being said to us by the government and by health authorities. Just in terms of also the issue of rhythms in the city and how we move. I've been doing some research on people who have been working, who've moved out of the city and working remotely. So moving away from, I suppose, a daily commute from their home to their place of work, but moving further out and then going in less often because they're able to work remotely 3, 4, 5 days a week, perhaps just going in for meetings. And it seems to be the case that will happen more now because of more people working remotely and not needing to go into the office as often, and not even being allowed to be in the office. You know, even if you are allowed to be in there, there won't be any other people there. So yeah, interesting to think about. Did anyone have any final thoughts? Okay, well, 1:57. I think we are pretty close. We might give people a minute or two to grab a coffee before their next Zoom meeting. So thank you very much, everyone. That was great. It's the first time I've done anything like this. So I think it went really well. The tech managed to hold out, which is often the main issue with these things. Not too much echoes or disconnections. So thanks, everyone. And looking forward to the next one. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Andrew.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.